Our guest this week is Professor Alan Lee Williams. He was president of the Atlantic Treaty Association. He is president of the Atlantic Council here in the United Kingdom, and he is a former member of Parliament. Welcome to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. Our guest today is Professor Alan Lee Williams. Professor Williams was a Labour Member of Parliament for many years. He served as Denis Healey's, he famously served as Denis Healey's PPS, Parliamentary Private Secretary, then Defence Secretary, of course. And he was also President of the Atlantic Council in the United Kingdom. And he is former President of the Atlantic Treaty Association. Professor Williams, very great honour to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us on ANN TV.
With you.
Well, bless you. Well, we have a kind of pattern here, so we'll go first to a brief introductory video, and then we'll come to our discussion, if we may.
Of course, yes.
Thank you. Article 5 serves as the basis of a fundamental principle in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It provides that if a NATO ally is the victim of an armed attack, each and every other member of the alliance will consider this act of violence as an armed attack against all members and will take the actions it deems necessary to assist the ally attacked. The principle of collective defense is at the very heart of NATO's founding treaty. It remains a unique and enduring principle that binds its members together, committing them to protect each other and setting a spirit of solidarity within the alliance. NATO invoked Article 5 of the Washington Treaty for the first time in its history, following the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the United States. Defense and disarmament remain key issues for the nations of the world. The world diverts huge resources to the defense sector, leaving basic needs such as food, health, education, employment, and environmental challenges greatly underfunded. Weapons have devastating impacts, especially in the developing world and in conflict zones. Military preparations have devastating effects on the process of sustainable development. They represent a massive distortion of the use of humanity's precious resources and talents. British membership of the European Union is a thorny issue for those in the UK, and the prospect of Brexit, Britain breaking away from Brussels, has moved up the political agenda in tandem with the rise of the United Kingdom Independence Party in Britain today. Pro-Europeans have strong views and believe that the time for decisive nationalism has passed. The EU goes way beyond being a mere economic union and advocates the free movement of goods and peoples within EU borders. Many would argue that the EU is fast becoming the United States of Europe. However, former Premier Tony Blair has warned that any referendum on Britain's European Union membership would cause economic chaos for Britain. So, Professor Williams, thank you so much again for being with us. We've got three issues for discussion. We're going to talk about Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. We're going to talk about the whole issue of disarmament versus defense, if you like, to put it broadly. And we're going to talk about the question of the European Union, which is seminal for us in Britain. Let's start with NATO, Article 5. I mean, you have a long-standing association with defense issues, both in Parliament, out of Parliament. You're still currently president of the Atlantic Council here in the UK, in the United Kingdom, which is very much an organization that supports the ethos of NATO.
Yes.
NATO is built on the its founding principles, democracy and freedom and security, three of the key issues for NATO. Article 5, we were going to discuss this. Now, Article 5 for our listeners is, well, why don't I let you tell me what Article 5 is?
Well, Article 5 is an attack against one NATO member, it's an attack against all.
Right.
And it was a very controversial thing when they were drawing up the various statutes, as I put it that way, for NATO. Some people were a bit worried about it. And it's never been used except when the Twin Towers were in receipt of 2 aircraft exploding, bringing the towers down, as we all know. The General Secretary at that time, Lord Robertson, did use it. But in my view, that was a good thing to do diplomatically, but it wasn't designed for that purpose. Article 5 is a really serious obligation. And just using it in that way, was some people thought was a little bit strange.
And it is a very serious obligation. I mean, what we're saying is that if an actual NATO member state is attacked, then NATO is obliged to come in and defend it. I mean, had Ukraine been a NATO member state, then the consequences could have been very serious.
Yeah, very serious indeed. And that's why it's important to have an Article 5, because at the present moment, to make it contemporary, although we were dealing at that time with the Soviet Union, the idea was to make it clear to the Soviet Union that we were an alliance which had the backing of the United States, and that if in any way the sovereignty of any of those countries that had signed the Atlantic Treaty were attacked, we would respond with force.
So in a very real way, even today, let's say, looking at current issues, were, God forbid, war to break out, full-scale war to break out cross-border between Syria and Turkey, NATO would be obliged, presumably, to come to the defense of it. No. Right. No, I'm misunderstanding.
It must be a NATO member.
I see.
Yes.
I see. So, so we're talking. So the NATO members, the key NATO members, United States, Britain.
Yes, and Germany and France.
Right.
Portugal and Spain, all the principal members.
Right.
Any attack against them would bring a military response.
Okay. And so partnership for peace nations that are associated with NATO, I mean,
they're not covered.
They're not covered.
No.
And a nation like Turkey, which in my mind is strongly associated with NATO, is not.
Oh, it's a full member.
Yeah.
So if Turkey were to be attacked.
Okay, got you. If Turkey were attacked.
It'd be a different matter for NATO.
Right. So if Turkey were to be attacked by Syria, for example, then that would bring out full-scale war, wouldn't it? It would be a major issue.
If there was agreement to use Article 5, it's not automatic.
Now this is what. Okay.
It is automatic in the sense that there has to be some response, but it could be diplomatic response, economic response, below the level of force, or limited force.
Right.
But Article 5 really is unleashing all your forces.
Right.
That's a very serious
Potentially.
thing. Potentially, yes.
Yes. But in practice it doesn't necessarily have to be that.
No, it doesn't have to be that. There are various gradations. That's why when Dennis Healey was Defence Secretary, with McNamara, who was the US Defence Secretary, worked out a graduated policy where you go up in steps to the final step, which is nuclear.
Right.
But underneath at the steps, there'd be lots of other things you can do short of nuclear, and diplomacy would come into play there. After all, Article 5 is the centre of NATO's deterrence. Okay. That is to deter war.
So, so in effect, then this is decided. I mean, we have a NATO commander in Europe. I think Ben Hodges is the U.S. general who is in command of NATO in Europe. Yeah. In command of NATO in Europe, but does NATO have different commands? So it would be.
No, he's in command of NATO forces, but he's not in charge of policy.
Right. So he
Yeah.
does what he's told,
Yeah.
and you have the policy of NATO is decided by the presidents and prime ministers of its
Yes.
various member
Yes.
states, who would instruct, who presumably meet and then would instruct Ben Hodges as to
Yes.
what to do in
Yes.
this instance.
Yes.
Um,
He would, of course, he would anticipate what they were going to do, because diplomacy works that way. I mean,
Right.
he wouldn't be ignorant about what they were going to decide to do. So
Hmm.
he could start moving his forces about the moment he got the signal from them, yes, this is an Article 5 operation.
Right. Okay. And then General Hodges would go into action, but he would be guided by this graded approach.
Yes, and of course, above all, remember he is an American soldier, general. And so he would have to be absolutely certain that the president was behind him. So would the European element of NATO, because the European element of NATO would not want to use Article 5 unless it was absolutely certain that the Americans were behind the whole operation.
And Article 5 could not be brought into play for a situation like Ukraine.
No.
It's definitely a threat to a NATO
And that is, you've touched on a nerve there, because you see the Partnership for Peace program, as you know, you mentioned it yourself, is part of a process of gradually bringing your forces up to the standard required by NATO. And once that's achieved, politically you could become a full member of NATO. But the Ukraine I must tell you, is a long way away from that situation. I mean, I've made 5 or 6 visits there, and there's so much ambiguity about their position, because politically they're so divided, and NATO doesn't want to get into a position where they're interfering in any way with the internal affairs of the Ukraine.
Yes.
So the Partnership for Peace doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to become members of NATO, but the process normally points in that direction.
And so, I mean, taking that case in point, you could, or could you, blame NATO, or NATO moves to embrace Ukraine more closely in the Partnership for Peace and so on, part of the what would you call it, casus bellum, the cause of Russia's move into the Crimea, or would you not think that way?
Well, I mean, Putin is taking that line.
Yes.
After all, there's history there, isn't there? It was part of the former Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
Khrushchev decided that they could have a degree of autonomy, and it moved on from there. And so I think Putin takes the view, well, that's our sphere of influence. Please don't interfere in our sphere of influence. On the other hand, for a country that is partner for peace and is being subject to military action, doesn't mean to say NATO won't do anything.
Right.
And NATO has deployed its forces, as you know, particularly in respect of the Baltic states, because all 3 of the Baltic states are covered by Article 5.
Right, because they are full members of NATO.
Full members of NATO.
Latvia, Estonia,
Yes.
and Lithuania.
And that's why in a few weeks' time there'll be 10,000 British troops taking part in manoeuvres with other NATO forces as well. And with the navies being deployed
Because
as an indication to the Soviets, to the Russians, that you be careful about this one.
yes.
This could escalate into a war which none of us want.
Right. And Russia has rather been, well, I mean, prodding at NATO members. It's overflights, virtual overflights of
Yes,
the UK,
yes.
well, UK waters and so on.
Yes. Putin knows what he's doing, though. I think he's in full control, but there are forces there that might mean that even he is not in full control. So he has to be careful that we don't move into an accidental war of the most terrible nature. It doesn't have to be a strategic war, but a tactical nuclear war, for example, would be terrible enough.
Yes, of course. No, it would be horrendous. And this present Cold War that we're seeing between, I suppose it's between NATO and Russia. Is it, to what degree is it our fault? Is it entirely Russia's fault, or is it nobody's fault? Is it just circumstances beyond everyone's?
Well, it's the way history's played its hand. I mean, quite frankly, nobody's without fault. But the Russians have always had a very strong nationalistic element in, even when they were all Soviets.
Yes, yes.
Soviet policy was no different from Russian nationalism, going back to the Tsar. And it's easily played upon in their politics. And that's what Putin has done, you see. He's played this nationalist card, which is a very dangerous one, because the Russians are such nationalists. And they claim, well, this eastern part of this Crimea or the whole of Ukraine is really our sphere of influence.
Yes.
We recognise a certain degree of sovereignty, or limited sovereignty. Don't you interfere with it. And we believe, this is Putin, we believe that you are. And we say, no, we believe you are. After you're the one that is using force, and he is using force, considerable force, dressing up people not as Russian soldiers, but they are regular Russian soldiers, just dressed up in military gear, saying, oh, no, we're part of, we've been...
Well, I was just smiling because that is, I remember listening to a report that stated that was the idea of deception is a standard Russian military tactic from history. I mean, it's one that they is in their military textbooks.
And they're good at it.
Yes.
So you have to be, you must make sure your judgments are clear.
Yes.
But the question can be turned on to Mr. Putin himself. He's got to be careful, because we've got our forces there. He's got to make it. He's got to understand that any attack against the 3 Baltic states, any of them, will lead to a military response from NATO. As long as he understands that, then the other business can be settled, no doubt, in some other way.
Right. So, I mean, there will have to be compromise over the Ukraine.
Yes.
And one has to be realistic about that. The situation, I mean, of course, what has happened is that this emergence of, I don't know whether you want to call it a new Cold War, I don't know whether you would, but this tension between Russia and the West has set back peace building in the Middle East considerably. The issue of Syria, where we have a lot of listeners, comes to mind. I mean, it's unfortunate for the poor citizens of Syria that Russia and America are not getting on, because it means a Geneva III, for example, is much harder to have, and the whole process of resolving many of the outstanding issues is more difficult. The question, I mean, we move on from Article 5, but just one, going off at a slight tangent, to what degree, it's a very unfair question, to what degree is Turkey a rogue member of NATO? I mean, a rogue in the sense that the whole issue now, one of the issues that concerns the world today is ISIS, or what many people call, the Arabs call it Daesh. They call themselves Islamic State. We in Britain tend to call it ISIS. But whatever you call it, we have the emergence of a very, it's charitable to call it radical, a very extreme group in the Middle East, a violent group, which is diametrically opposed to our interests. And Turkey is equivocal, perhaps because of the Kurdish question or for various other reasons. Does that, I mean, has enough been done to bring Turkey into line?
Well, it's not easily done. Let me say that I've made several visits during my period as presidency to meet the Turkish people, and we've had very good meetings with them. But that was some time ago. that was before the Islamic element came into government there.
Yes, yes.
So they're much more difficult to deal with now, and the first signs that they were turning a little bit away from NATO was in Kosovo and Bosnia, when they refused to allow American forces to go through their territory to be possibly used in terms of supplying ammunition, not troops so much, ammunition,
yes.
artillery and that kind of thing, to help the Kurds. Now that's a tricky subject with the Turks.
Yes, of course.
So that was the added complication there. But I think that I wouldn't call them disloyal members of NATO. That would be going a bit too far, but they are not as helpful as they should be. And that's of great concern because they want to become, at least they said until quite recently, want to become a member of the European Union. And I'm sure that it's been made clear to them that that goes with a lot of other agreements as well about defence and weapons and so on. Because the most important agreement was the 1949 treaty starting NATO, incidentally started by Ernest Bevin and Acheson.
Okay.
Acheson being the
Dean
defence
Acheson, yes.
Dean Acheson, exactly. And it was Ernest Bevin that made the right proposals to the Americans, which led to NATO. At that time, of course, Turkey didn't come in right away. Turkey came in a bit later. But they were then felt threatened by the Soviets. And I think now they no longer feel threatened.
But there must be a disappointment about
Yeah.
the way the negotiations to join the European Union have gone for Turkey, and perhaps, is it sour grapes that they're being more difficult over NATO? Are they trying to get their revenge is too strong a word, but is there a certain irritation on the part of the Turks?
Yes, a lot of irritation. I think they were not satisfied that the Iraq war was a satisfactory thing to do.
Right.
And I think their view is that if it had been done in a slightly different way, they would have supported it. But there was no preparation, as we all know now, unfortunately. There was no preparation for what would happen after the war. And a number of very bad decisions were taken to disband the Iraqi army.
Yes.
But it could have been turned around as,
Yes.
as a professional force
Yes, of course.
to really work for what Britain and America was trying to do.
We're seeing the cost of that now, aren't we?
You see, we're seeing the cost of that now, and that's the big mistake there. And I think that Turkey has taken all that into consideration, plus the fact that they have a prime minister who frightens their army.
Yes, Erdogan, yes.
So-
yes.
Because
Yes.
when I used to go there many years ago, of course, the dominant force was the army. Now the army have lost their position. I don't think they'll be able to retain it
No.
or seek to do so. But Turkey has changed, and it's led by a very firm leader who knows what he wants and doesn't automatically go along with what the European element of NATO are saying, especially as they've been looked upon as an unwelcome member of the European Union.
Right, right. Interesting. Well, we should come to the European Union itself later.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, we said we were going to talk about disarmament, armament issues. It's an interesting one for the United Kingdom because we spend a lot of money on cruise missile, on the submarines. The question as to whether they should continue is a major political issue.
It is.
Some would argue that what we need is boots on the ground that can be used in peacekeeping, and that the world has changed. What's your thinking on strategy?
Well, I am a firm deterrence man, and satisfied that Britain does need to have a nuclear capability, and I'm also satisfied that they do need 4 submarines, not 3, as the Liberal Democrats are suggesting.
Okay.
Labour's firmly behind the idea in this general election, and I think will be afterwards, when the Strategic Defence Review starts, to support the nuclear element of NATO. It's not a threatening posture, having submarines carry nuclear capability. It's a defensive thing. It'll only be used if we're attacked.
Yes, so you see it as valuable. Britain should be a nuclear power. You don't feel that there is an argument for those days are gone? Why not we have more disarmament? I mean, why do we need...
Yes, I think it should run parallel. We should use the deterrence to help to bring about multilateral disarmament. That was the policy in any case when we were facing the Soviet Union, and they got into negotiations, SALT I, SALT II. You can name all those agreements, but with the pressure that a war was unthinkable.
But you don't think, I mean, who is, whether we have nuclear weapons or we don't have nuclear weapons, who's going to use them? I mean, it is horrendous to think that anybody would ever use...
No, but that's the deterrent element. You never quite know. But it's certainly not the intention of NATO in its belief in Article 5 that it would ever be used in an aggressive way.
But you wouldn't believe in unilateral disarmament? You don't think that we should just set an example to the world and...
No, certainly not. I think the CND movement here made a big mistake. They held off the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we got into very dangerous territory with the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which in the end were completely taken over by very strong left-wing groups that were really very close to the Soviet policy, foreign policy.
In the sense that they were pro-unilateral disarmament?
Yes, they were.
Yes.
Pro-Soviet foreign policy.
Well, you would say so.
I would say so. Yes.
In the sense that they believed in Soviet Union's expansionism.
No, they believed in. They just thought that the Soviet foreign policy was more to their liking than their own British or American foreign policy.
Okay.
I mean, they've made that absolutely clear. I know, because I debated the issue with them, over many years.
And going back a few years, we did have an attempt under Robin Cook, I know it's a little while back now, but to introduce an ethical arms policy.
Foreign policy.
Well, foreign policy and arms sales and so forth.
Yes.
Did you think that was a complete waste of time? Or
No, it was just unfortunate in its timing, just when the world was coming apart.
Yes.
To try and introduce an ethical foreign policy was not the best time. I think if we can get some stability back, and that's a big if, but that must be our aim, diplomatically, to get stability bit. And then you can start thinking about all of us having an ethical foreign policy.
And when we talk about ethical foreign policy, presumably there's a need for ethics with regard to military and defense policies. We see these drones used outside zones of war by the United States. There are huge ethical questions with regard to modern warfare. Arguably, in some situations, you could argue that America's consistent use of drones in Yemen, for instance, has strengthened Al-Qaeda in Yemen, because the collateral damage has been of such a degree that civilians, it's a tribal thing. Once you kill a member of the tribe,
but it would be more difficult to have troops on the ground. I mean, you'd make even more enemies then. And I think these weapons controlled from bases in America does make me uncomfortable. I have to admit that very strongly with you. On the other hand, the alternative is that you don't use these weapons. You put your troops on the ground to achieve what you want to achieve. And I think that would really be worse. And after we are dealing with people who are far from ethical themselves. These people are terrible.
Yes, but I mean,
Yeah.
in some cases, though, the line is difficult. I mean, there are questions, aren't there? Yes, okay, if we're talking about Al-Qaeda in Iraq or Afghanistan or ISIS in Syria or Iraq, we know we've got a force that is evil. But then you get to the more borderline questions. Then the Houthis in Yemen, are they evil? Do they have grievances? Then you come to Libya, a country racked by civil war and so on. I mean, your enemies become grayer and grayer, and we are using drones, or we, the Anglo-American Alliance, are using drones.
No, but not the Anglo-American Alliance. Or not.
Just the Americans.
No, it's those who are willing to join along with America in the use of these weapons. They are not. It's not part of the NATO structure.
Right.
No decision's been taken in NATO that these weapons should be used in the way that they're being used. It's the coalitions of the willing, and America has built up a lot of, and it's necessary to do it. Preferably to have Arabs states on your side. And gradually you can see what's happening is that they are beginning to line up with them. And so a lot of the fighting, and certainly the aircraft used by the Saudis, although they're bought from the West and help to keep our economies thriving, but nevertheless they are being used as part of the coalition of the willing.
So
it's not an alliance. You can't say it's an alliance.
you could argue that this is producing, I mean, your coalition of the willing is producing a new sort of, we have a kind of a Shiite Sunni civil war within Islam in the Middle East.
Well, unfortunately we do.
And we have now a new Sunni NATO with Egypt, a Sunni NATO, I mean, this is very unfair, but a Sunni equivalent of NATO with Egypt and the United Arab Emirates and other nations of this kind, Arab nations working together against what they perceive as serious threats.
Unfortunately, that's true. I mean, what you just said is true. And I don't have any remedy for it as a person. I can't see. To do nothing would be inexcusable in view of the way that they're behaving. Do too much and you're going to suck yourself into historic battles we don't need to fight. And diplomacy must be used. But when you're dealing with ISIS, I mean, they're not interested in diplomacy.
No, clearly. They've...
they're just, barbaric. They've gone back, we've all gone back to the Crusade period where these things did happen. Yeah. Well, I noticed with my friends in Toynbee Hall, Bangladeshi friends, I used to go to their plays on a Sunday evening because I lived in.
Yes.
In fact, my family lived with me.
Gosh.
That's part of the tradition there. So I was always available, and I went to all the mosques I could go to. I didn't understand exactly what's going on in there because sometimes I understand they were saying things which I would have quibbled about, to say the least. But I had lots of friends who brought me up to date with what was really being said. And gradually they made it clear to me that the atmosphere had changed. And they blamed British foreign policy. They said, well, this is the result of British foreign policy. But I know it goes deeper than that. And a lot of academics who studied the whole subject know it has gone a lot further. So I decided to write a paper explaining the great divide between the two sides, the Shias and the Sunnis and so on. They agreed with it because it was very difficult to disagree with, but I could see that they thought, well, no, that's not the real reason. The real reason is that it's your foreign policy and so on. Whereas it was more to do with profound disagreements between the Islamist people themselves. Luckily for this country, it doesn't manifest itself very strongly, but it's there.
Yes. Yes.
But that's where I first came across it, and also, if you know that the mayor of Tower Hamlets behaves as if he's conducting a local council in Pakistan or somewhere like that.
Yes, he has some trouble now, I think.
There's a lot of trouble, you see. And he's a nice man. I've met him. In many respects, I have regard for him. But I feel that the evidence that's been produced, which is sub judice at the moment, of course I can't comment on it, nobody can comment on it, but I hope it doesn't do too much damage personally to him, because he's one of these people who means well, but a lot of people mean well, at the same time do a hell of a lot of damage.
Yes, of course. Oh, bless you. Well, we'll talk about people meaning well and doing damage. Let's talk briefly about our third subject before we run out of time, and that is the European Union. There are people meaning well who intend, if they have their way, to take us out of the European Union.
Yes.
It's become a very hot political issue. Presumably you're an internationalist, or you not?
Yes, I'm pro-European. I want to stay in the European Union, but I do feel that there are a number of reforms that must be made. Otherwise, it will be impossible for us to continue membership of the European Union. The exit is there,
yes,
and we're getting very close to it. And I don't think that if Cameron continues as Prime Minister, which I of course hope he doesn't, but if he does, he's got to get some firm concessions, very deep concessions. I don't think he can get them.
Yes.
I don't think they're going to concede these concessions. So I think that would lead us to an exit from the European Union. He's played it badly from the start, but that's where we're going.
And you think an exit is a real possibility. There is a lot of resentment of Europe in Britain.
There is, and it's justifiable. I mean, I belong. My family are Thames Watermen and Lightermen on the River Thames. They're the people that handled the tugs and barges, and in the earlier beginnings, when the people that went before the bridges were built.
Yes,
they were the men that ferried you across the water. So there's a long tradition there, and the European Commission decided that our licensing system within the Watermen's Company wasn't up to date enough, and called the Watermen's Company a comfortable little body, which understated how professional it really was, and how the licenses, so people become tug masters, pilots, river pilots, or handle any kind of craft, had to be fully trained. And the apprenticeship, because of the school leaving age, was 7 years at one point. Then it went on to 5 as the school leaving age crept up. So the apprenticeship became shorter. Well, in their wisdom, they intervened, and our government, which is this present government, didn't intervene sufficiently strongly, in spite of the fact that they knew what the position was. Germany opted out of this agreement.
Yeah, so many. I mean,
many things we agree to, and others opt out.
Yes,
that's what caused resentment.
Yes,
and I know that from this instance.
Yes,
so I feel very strongly about it.
So we have this, but you aren't in favour of. I mean, despite this, despite the many other problems that Britain has seen with the EU, I mean, we could list them: the common fisheries policy and so on.
We could, yes. Please don't.
Right, but the point is, despite these problems, you are still pro-European.
Yes, I think it's in our long-term interest that we remain. We must alter the nature. No more, no further moves towards new members. No further new moves towards a federal Europe.
So you don't believe in the United States of Europe?
No.
But
no, I don't think it would work. And I mean, there's no point going down that road at all. But there is a good case for the European Union, based on its assumptions now, where we can work collectively together, and trade-wise very important, and give us a muscle we wouldn't have if if
Yes.
the European Union disintegrated.
And would you believe that other nations of the world should go down the same route? I mean, should we see, we have in the Arab world, we have the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. There are those within that organization that would like to see that expanded to take in Jordan and possibly Yemen,
Yes.
and then become a kind of Arab European Union.
Yeah.
I mean, do you believe
No, I think that's a good idea, but as long as they learn the lessons
from our mistakes?
of creep, how it
Yes.
creeps along without any proper discussion with national parliaments.
Mm.
Ministers meet, don't understand fully what's being proposed. Well,
Yes.
that's the impression one gets.
Yes.
And then you find it's mission creep.
Yes, and the European Union has no. I mean, it's flirted with the idea of a common foreign policy, and we have Baroness Ashton or whatever,
Yes,
who is our supremo, our foreign policy supremo before the EU.
Yeah.
But we don't have a common foreign policy. Do you argue for one?
Yeah, I think it would be sensible to get one. I mean, I thought that Baroness
Ashton, yeah.
Ashton was very effective. She wasn't at the beginning
Mm.
because she had no experience of foreign affairs, but she learnt, a very bright woman,
Mm.
very clever woman. She soon learnt and she made a big impact. Now, I do believe if it's possible to have a common foreign policy and defence policy, but I don't see it on the. I can't see how it can be reached in the way that it's being attempted.
Mm.
For example, the most important defence organisation we belong to is NATO. But NATO, because of American foreign policy, particularly with President Obama looking elsewhere, and as the century moves on, they'll be more concerned with China.
Yes.
And so there is a long-term view, which I would accept, that in that case we do need to work out a European foreign and defence policy. I'm not saying that needs to happen if America still takes an interest in Europe, but should they lose interest, or simply because their interests no longer served by Europe, then I would like to think that the European Union would go down that road.
So to have more weight, to have more
weight,
clout.
Yes.
Yes.
But alone, I mean, rather like the Scots in their referendum, if they'd succeeded, and they're still fighting for it, as we know, if that's achieved, they will be poorer, we will be poorer.
Yes. Yes.
What's the
Yes.
sense of that?
Yes. Interesting.
And so I would use the same argument in terms of withdrawing from the European Union. And I think the Prime Minister privately takes that view.
Oh.
That's his difficulty, because there are so many people who are in love with this new party, UKIP,
Yes.
who are Conservative members of Parliament,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
who are pushing, making it clear to Prime Minister Cameron that if you don't go down this road, you're finished as our leader.
Yes.
And there's the shadow of the Mayor of London
Yes. Coming up, looming up.
looming up.
Yes.
You can understand that
Yes.
why he feels internally, politically, he's got to move.
Yes.
But I think it's against his private judgment. I'm sure it is, because I've read all his speeches.
Okay. Yes.
You
Yes.
know, the bit of the thing comes through in people when they speak, particularly when they speak as I am off the cuff. I hope I'm not going to regret too many things.
No, you've done well. Well, I don't know. I think we've covered all the ground. I'm going to draw things to a conclusion. I'm just so grateful that you've been with us. Maybe by touching on, I mean, NATO. I'm always much a great believer in the four freedoms that President Roosevelt espoused: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. But NATO is freedom, democracy, security. In some ways, much the same, isn't it? That's the core,
Yes,
and that's what NATO stands for, and that's what NATO hopefully will defend.
Yes.
Democracy, freedom,
definitely,
and security.
absolutely.
Well, Professor Williams, thank you so much. We haven't quite come to an end because we have a little further discussion, but we're going to move on to another subject.
Yeah.
Bless you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So, Professor Williams, we're back, but just for one more concluding issue, we have this practice of talking about a book on ANN at the end of the interviews, which you'll be familiar with from the British program Desert Island Discs. It's kind of that sort of slot. But in your case, we're going to talk about a book or books that have not been published yet.
Correct.
And one of them relates to your early life as a waterman. We referred to that before.
Yes.
Tell us about that. You're editing a book?
I haven't written it.
Yes.
But I've edited the book.
Right.
And it's a first-class read, there's no question about it. And it is really the history and the politics of our country. After all, the River Thames goes right back to Roman times and beyond. And there have been many battles in the Thames, as you know.
Yes.
We even had the Dutch fleet that floated up the Thames at one point and sunk all our ships. So it's all there.
Yes.
But the most fascinating bit is the contribution of the Thames waterman enlightenment in the First and Second World Wars.
Of course.
Which it gives it a more modern ring.
Yes.
And most of them were recruited by Mountbatten and Ernest Bevin. Mountbatten was then Supreme Allied. Well, I think he was very close to Churchill anyway. He was appointed eventually to take a leading role in D-Day.
Yes.
He asked Ernest Bevin that he wanted to have, he said the Royal Navy, which of course he was a fine specimen himself, not very good in shallow waters, he said. Our ships are not for shallow waters, but we've got to make some landings. And we're going to try a couple of testers in occupied France. And we want men who can handle craft in those kind of conditions. Do you think you've got them in the labour force? And Ernest Bevin said, right away, yes. He said, the Thames Lightermen, they won't come better than that. He said that all their craft are flat-bottomed. They're a bellicose lot. Well, in this book, the modern aspects are, of course, more interesting to the present generation. And that's the First World War and the Second World War, where watermen played their part. But it was the Second World War where the lightermen were sent for, as it were, following a meeting between Lord Mountbatten, who spoke to Ernest Bevin, who was the Minister for Labour in the coalition government, Churchill's coalition government, and said that the Royal Navy are good with the big ships at sea and not so good in shallow waters, but we want to invade a continent, but we want to have a couple of trials before we do it. Can we test it with your men? Do you have any men you could recommend? He said, yes, I would recommend Thames Lightermen and Aberdeen Seamen, fishermen.
Yes,
they were very good too.
Yes.
Very good in confined waters. And so it became known as the Millionaire Navy because they all paid trades union rates of pay. That's the influence of Ernest Bevin, of course.
Wow. And so and your family have been watermen.
Yes, 300 years.
And you left school at the age of 14?
Yes, I had to because, well, let me tell you, with some qualification, I didn't actually have to. My father didn't want us to go into the lighterage business, but Geoffrey and I organised a homework strike in the school. Because the V1s, which were the aircraft, looked like aircraft, but they were flying bombs. Giving them a better description, that's what they were. And the V2s were missiles, rockets. And as a consequence, when we were at school, we spent most of our time running in and out of the air raid shelter at school. And then when we got home, we spent the night in the air raid shelter.
Yes, because of all the bombings.
Because of all the bombing. And Geoffrey and I were most anxious to take part in the war.
Your brother Geoffrey.
My twin brother. And we wrote a book about it, which is recently being published, called A Couple of Duffers Go to War. And we wanted to play an active part. We'd been in the ATC, the Army Cadets. But it wasn't until we joined the National Fire Service as messengers that we went out every other night with the firemen in this period. Consequently, we didn't do our homework. And so that's why we organised our homework strike to cover our lack of work.
And this led to you being let off school at the age of 14 to
Yes,
join?
I'm afraid it did.
Yeah, and
So
and the book is the tale of the lighterman.
Yes, it is.
It's published in July?
Yes, it'll be published in July, and I don't know whether you'd like me to come and talk about it.
Well, I certainly would.
Yeah.
Tell us who. Do we know the publisher?
At this stage, I don't know.
Okay.
But the Waterman's Company does. They've got a publisher.
Right.
I don't know who it is.
Okay. Yeah, but no, but but it's a book to look out. Do we know the title?
Well, there's been a big argument about the title. The first title they came up with gave the impression that the Waterman and Lightham actually lived on the river.
Right.
And I wanted that. I disagreed very strongly with that. Unfortunately, they've gone ahead with it. So it gives the impression in the title that these men live on the river. Of course, they're not as the canal longboatmen who used the canals. Of course, they lived aboard their craft. They owned their craft, they lived aboard it. Sometimes they hired other craft as well, but their home was their barge. Lightmen have never had that. They've always come ashore. They have homes all over the place.
Well, we look forward to this book, The Lighterman of the Thames. We will have to announce it when it comes out.
Yes.
And bless you and thank you for being our guest on ANN. It's been a real joy and a privilege to have you.
Well, thank you. I hope I haven't made too many further enemies.
No, I'm sure you've done just fine. Professor Williams, thank you very much indeed.